Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Hello, my name is Gerard, and welcome to another edition of St. Paul's Letters to America. This is the program that asks, what if St. Paul were alive today? What if he were here to write a letter to America? What is it he would tell us? What would he say? Well, we think we know what he would say. He would tell us exactly what he told the people in the Mediterranean world 2,000 years ago. And why is that? Because his letters expressed the truth. And the truth is timeless. Like all Scripture, St. Paul's letters express truths that are timeless. Now today, as we've done in other editions of this program, what we do is we take St. Paul's letters and we look at them through the prism of some issue that is facing American society and American culture today. And we often look at two things people say never to talk about at the same time: religion and politics. But we do this here on this program, and as we do, we always bear a certain motto in mind: love and kindness through the light of truth. And hopefully that is what we do. Hopefully that is what we do here. Now today, what is our program going to talk about? Our program is going to talk about D&E Times. We are living in times of distraction and evasion. There's no other explanation than the fact that we have clouded our own minds. There's no other explanation that would explain how we can convince ourselves that abortion, horrible procedures for abortion, make sense. They're allowed. They're moral. They're ethical. How can we possibly do this? You know, it is no mistake that we're at a point where these things can be allowed, even though we have been living with more than 400 years of modern secular thought, which has elevated man, which is sought to cast off God, which is sought to say that man can decide things, man can create things, man can develop his own morality. It is man that we can look to rather than to God. And we've been living with this. It's progressed from Francis Bacon through René Descartes, men like Immanuel Kant, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, others up through today. And this kind of subjective moral thinking has progressed to the point where we've told ourselves abortion is all right, abortion is okay. But there are a couple of events in our news that have happened recently that point this out rather poignantly. We look at them and it causes us to think, how can these things possibly make sense? How can these things possibly be real? One occurred in the state of Alabama, where a state representative said in relation to an abortion law, an anti-abortion law that was being considered in the state, which he was arguing against, he said that when we have babies that are unwanted and we bring them into the world, they can be unloved. And that if they've become unloved, they're likely to turn to things that are against society. They'll likely reject authority. They'll turn into criminals, and then perhaps beyond that, they'll turn into criminals that commit murder, and beyond that, they'll commit murders of such a heinous case that they'll be given the death penalty and that we'll end up having to execute such children. Now, forgetting for the moment that there are a great many ifs in that whole long train of events, and that certainly would not apply to the majority of kids that are going to be subject to abortion. But forgetting all that, just looking at what he says is problematic. Why? Because at the end of this long analysis, what he says is that it is better to kill the children now. Why? You know, if we bring unwanted children into this world to become unloved, we will end up having to kill them later. So, in his words, and this is a quote, kill them now or kill them later. That was his justification for saying that a bill making abortion illegal should not be passed. And this particular gentleman, his name is John Rogers, a Democrat legislator from Birmingham, Alabama. Mr. Rogers happens to be a member of St. Mary's Catholic Church. He is a professed Catholic, but he says he also believes in a woman's right to choose. The now well-known case of a Catholic saying, the very common case of a Catholic saying, well, I'm against abortion personally, but I do believe in a woman's right to choose, and all of the irony and the inconsistencies that are involved in that statement. But that's one event. And that event, if we look at it, appears as one of a man who is distracted. He concerns himself with a woman's right to choose. He concerns himself with the death penalty. He concerns himself with unloved children being brought up in a cruel world. He concerns himself with all these things. He looks and he focuses his attention on all these things, and yet he doesn't look at the unborn child. He doesn't have concern or empathy for the unborn child. He is distracted. Another event that we'll look at is one that occurred in the state of Kansas. And this one involves the Kansas Supreme Court, where they made a monumental decision. It's been described as the most significant decision in the history of the Supreme Court of that state. It's been described as one of the most radical in the country because it allows abortion in Kansas on a constitutional level. The court ruled that a law against abortion in Kansas violated the terms and the provisions of the state constitution, and therefore abortion now is allowed in that state as a constitutional right, so that even if Roe versus Wade were to someday be overturned, Kansans would have a constitutional right to abortion. And what type of abortion is allowed in Kansas now, specifically? Well, the lawsuit that arose in Kansas that resulted in this decision was one that challenged a law passed in the year 2015 by the legislature in Kansas, and the vote in the state legislature was rather large. It was more than just large; it was immense. The margin of victory in the House of Representatives in Kansas was 98 to 26. In the Senate, it was 31-9. Huge margins, 4-1 margins of victory. Why? Why would there be such great support for an anti-abortion bill? Because this particular bill outlawed what were known as dilation and evacuation abortions. These abortions are also known as D&E abortions. And this procedure, as I said, properly called dilation and evacuation, is one where, despite the seemingly scientific, innocuous terminology of dilation and evacuation, behind these euphemisms, the reality of this abortion procedure is that babies are literally dismembered. They are torn limb from limb inside the mother's womb, and they bleed to death, and then they're removed. That is the procedure that the Kansas legislature, the representatives of the people, decided was so wrong that they could pass the law by such wide margins, and yet the Kansas Supreme Court stepped up and said, no, you cannot have this law. It is unconstitutional. Why? Because the Kansas Constitution provides that every individual is, are you ready? Entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And out of that phrasing, the Kansas Supreme Court divined, if it is not blasphemous to use that word in this context, the Kansas Supreme Court took it upon themselves to create this right and divine the right to abortion. That seems like a bit of a stretch. So it does to a lot of people, including the lone dissenting justice, who basically called the court's reasoning on this matter sort of a trip through Alice in Wonderland. And we'll get into all that reasoning. But the court engaged in something that was very curious in reaching its conclusion. The decision in this case goes to some 200 pages, almost 200 pages. The majority opinion is almost 100, and then there were concurring opinions beyond that, or besides that. 200 pages of legal reasoning, high-minded, intellectual legal reasoning, sophisticated legal reasoning. And what conclusion did they come to? Well, the conclusion is, of course, abortion is legal. But what process did they use to get there? What did they look at? The funny thing is, they didn't look. They looked at everything. They went through 300 years of history. They went through the philosophy of John Locke and how it preceded the founding of the United States, and the philosophy, and it undergirded the philosophy for the Declaration of Independence and our own Constitution. They looked at that. They looked at the State Constitutional Convention that came together in the year 1859 to vote in this Constitution, the Constitution for the state of Kansas. And then they looked at events since. And so they looked at 300 years of history. They looked at so many different things. For 200 pages, they go on describing and discussing all of this, and yet they neglect to ask and to answer or to write about the single most fundamental question. They evade that question. Distraction, evasion. These are two examples of what, curiously, the human mind does in order to reach conclusions where the thinking, the goal, the objective was to elevate humanity. The assumption is that man is capable of taking care of himself, of running the world, of coming up and crafting his own morality. He can do everything he needs to do to create an ordered life for this world, and a better ordered life for this world where there's peace, throughout the globe. And he can do all this without God. He can do this on his own. He can use his own reason without God. And yet, after all of these centuries of pushing towards this goal, where we're now sort of perhaps reaping the benefits of all of this thought that has gone on before us, we come to this elevated state where we are deciding things on our own. We are deciding things without God. We are removing God from our society in ever-increasing ways. And we come up with decisions which allow us to think, well, it is okay to kill them now or kill them later. In the words of Governor Northam of Virginia, we can birth a baby and then decide whether or not it's going to live. We're getting to the point where we're sanctioning murder. Kill them now or kill them later. Birth the baby and then decide whether it lives. How does this make sense? How is this the product of sophisticated, elevated human thinking? Well, it's only if we cloud our minds. It's only if we fool ourselves. It's only if we can distract ourselves or we can evade questions, the most fundamental question entirely, that we can allow horrendous, horrific, gruesome procedures like D&E abortions. Yes, we are living in D&E times. Now, what would St. Paul say to us? If he were here to write a letter to America with these things going on in our country, what would he tell us? Well, would he not tell us? Would he not tell us this? We have not received the Spirit of the world, but the Spirit that is from God, so that we may understand the things freely given us by God. And we speak about them not with words taught by human wisdom, but with words taught by the Spirit, describing spiritual realities in spiritual terms. Now, the natural person does not accept what pertains to the Spirit of God, for to him it is foolishness, and he cannot understand it, because it is judged spiritually. The spiritual person, however, can judge everything. How indeed do people with a spiritual mindset judge these events that we've been describing? How would a person with a spiritual mindset judge the events in the state of New York where people celebrated a law? People stood up and cheered and clapped and celebrated a law. And these people, by the way, that I'm talking about are the legislators in the state of New York, the leaders of society in the state of New York, the chosen representatives of the people. They stood up, cheered, and applauded when a law was passed that allowed abortion in that state right up until the moment of birth. How can we explain this? What would St. Paul say to us? Would he not say, think about these things more from the point of view of God? Do not reject God, but accept him. Well, let's take a look a little bit more, shall we, into the comments by the gentleman from the great state of Alabama. Here is one who said, kill them now or kill them later. And in doing this, does he not admit something? Does he not give us something of a Freudian slip? He says, kill them now or kill them later. Who will be killed later? He's talking about people that would end up in an electric chair. He's talking about adult human beings. Kill them now or kill them later. Or, on either ends of that or, are things that he regards in an equivalent sense. He doesn't say, let's terminate the pregnancy. No, he says, kill them now or kill them later. An unborn child is treated in the same sentence, in the same way, with the same regard as a grown adult. The killing of an unborn child is treated the same way as the killing of an unborn adult. They are both human beings. They're both pure persons. They're both entitled, if you will, to the use of the word kill. Why would he possibly think that? Well, perhaps it is because he's a Catholic. Perhaps it is because he believes that human beings have a soul. Perhaps it is because he is taught that, as it says in the book of Jeremiah, God knows us by name before we are born. Perhaps he feels a sense of inner turmoil, a guilt over doing this and being in support of abortion. So then he comes out with the most aggressive, egregious statement: kill them now or kill them later. Let's just make up our minds and get used to it. Let's just do it. But nevertheless, it makes a startling admission, as did the words of Governor Northam of Virginia. We'll let the baby be born and then decide. Well, then we'll have a discussion over whether it will continue to exist. Now, the second part of that he didn't really say, but it was implied. He said, let the baby be born, and then we'll have a discussion in the context of an abortion. That's specifically what he said. I added, whether we let the baby live or die. But that's the inescapable conclusion of what he was saying. How can we talk in these terms? And further, the words of this representative from Alabama, John Rogers, the words of Mr. Rogers, they run against everything that the church stands for. Why? Well, for one thing, their philosophical outlook is completely wrong. He's concerned with the rights of the woman. He's concerned with a woman having to raise a child that she doesn't want to, a woman having to deal with maybe the expense of raising the child, maybe the mental, anxieties and stresses that come with raising a child, all of those things. He's concerned with that. He's concerned with the desires of the mother. And, of course, the desires of the father. The father should be in this process. He should bear these stresses and burdens as well. And if he doesn't, well, that's another failing. But many abortions take place because the father wants the abortions, because the father either doesn't want to have to bear these burdens and stresses. So he's concerned with these desires of these people. It's a framework. It's a philosophical framework where we're thinking from ourselves outward. We're thinking first from ourselves. We're thinking, what do we want first? And then, what do other people outside of us, away from us, what do those other people want? That comes second. The Christian outlook is very different. The Christian outlook is a self-sacrificing outlook which draws its strength and its origin from the cross. Christ did not live for himself. Christ lived for one reason, to sacrifice himself, to save us. He gave of himself for us. That is his example. The philosophical outlook is very different. It is the other person first. So when we're concerned about the desires of parents who don't want to raise a child, we're denying the example of the cross. We're denying everything that the cross stands for, everything that Christianity stands for. And this coming from a man who says he is Catholic. Much like many other people, much like the governor of New York State who says he's Catholic and supports abortion, much like the senator from Illinois, Richard Durbin, who's a Catholic and supports abortion, much like many other Catholics in this country in positions of governmental authority who support abortion. So in any event, we have this case of this gentleman down in Alabama distracting himself enough to the point where he can't even see this anymore. He can't see what he's in support of, how it opposes the cross itself, how it opposes all of the principles of Christianity, because those principles all derive from the cross. All right. How about the Kansas Supreme Court? How about we talk about that? Well, we've already described the decision a little bit, but I say it's a case of evasion. Mr. Rogers from Alabama distracted himself away. He distracted himself enough that he doesn't even have to think about the cross and what we've discussed. The Kansas Supreme Court evades one very large issue. They talk about many things, but they never talk about whether or not an unborn child is a life. They never talk about whether or not it's a living human being. And you would think that that's the first thing you have to decide. The Supreme Court for the U.S. in Roe versus Wade, they did that. And after that decision, people felt that abortion was permitted because, after all, It's a fetus. It's an embryo. It's a clump of tissue. It's not really a living person. The problem with justices sitting on Supreme Courts today and legislators sitting in state legislatures, the problem they have is that now we have ultrasounds. We can hear human heartbeats. We can see the head being formed. We can see fingers and toes. We can see the baby. We can't just simply think, well, it's just a clump of tissue. But nonetheless, we get to the point where we still think abortion is legal. Why? Well, it's very easy. We just simply don't answer the question anymore whether or not it's a living human being. Now, this kind of, the thinking that the Supreme Court in Kansas engaged in ran counter to a number of well-established judicial principles. For example, probably the foremost, the most prominent, principle of constitutional judicial interpretation is one that was started in a case that was rendered in 1803. It's the case that every first-year law student hears first in any kind of constitution class. It is the most important constitutional case in the U.S. It was called Marbury versus Madison. And in that decision, the court established the principle that, well, the U.S. Supreme Court gets to decide what is constitutional. It was a monumental case. But it also said, the court also said, that when there are matters which are, quote unquote, political questions, then the court will not intervene because those questions are properly decided by legislatures or by the executive branch. But there has to be a division of authority amongst the three branches. This is simply what we have understood for ages as our form of government, how our government works. The dissenting justice in the Kansas case said, well, the court threw all that out. They took it upon themselves to decide something that is really the province of the legislature. Now, there was another case called Baker versus Carr, 1962, that actually gave an enumerated list of the factors that courts should look at when they're deciding whether or not something is a political question. And it's interesting. The first one is a dead giveaway. Well, if the Constitution says that a certain subject area belongs specifically to a certain branch of government, that's fine. Often enough, you don't have that. Second of all, the next factor, the next standard for consideration, lack of a judicially discoverable and manageable standard for resolving the issue. If there's a problem coming up with standards to decide a question, well, then it should be left to the legislature. Courts need laws. Courts don't make policy decisions. Courts interpret the law. They need to have standards. Well, in this particular case, there is no standard for a court to apply if we're talking about a human life, when life begins. When life begins, that's a medical question, that's a religious question, that's a philosophical question. When does life begin? Is that something that should be the province of a court? Third standard, the impossibility of deciding without an initial policy determination of a kind clearly for non-judicial discretion. Well, let's pass that one for the moment. Another one, 4, the impossibility of a court's understanding independent resolution of undertaking independent resolution without expressing lack of the respect due a coordinate branch of government. Yes? That's a resounding yes here. Abortion is the most contentious social issue in our country today. It is often said that abortion is sort of a linchpin of so many other policy positions taken by people on both sides of a question these days. it has been, it remains this very thorny, hotly debated issue. And it is on this issue that the court decides to step in and decide. Does this seem like it might satisfy a political question standard that a court should restrain itself? It certainly does. Number 5, there are 6 standards here. This is number 5. An unusual need for unquestioning adherence to a political decision already made. Well, here you have the Kansas legislature deciding this question by a huge margin, expressing the will of the people. They are the people's representatives. Should not a court that perhaps had some sense of the virtue of humility or some sense of the established legal principle of not deciding a political question, especially when this wide margin of victory on this issue that came from the representatives of the people dealt with a very brutal procedure. Does not the court show a lack of respect for a legislature when the legislature is saying, yes, this is brutal, and we're not going to allow it, and here the court comes in and says different. How about number 6? The potentiality of embarrassment from multifarious pronouncements by various departments on one question. Well, yes, that standard is satisfied here as well. You've got a legislature saying we cannot have these dismemberment abortions. There was the Congress of the U.S. passed a law against partial birth abortions. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld that. Some justices in the case talked about D&E abortions as being very similar to partial birth abortions. And we have the Kansas legislature saying these D&E abortions are brutal. And you can have other abortions, but not this one. And here you have several justices on a Supreme Court coming in and saying, although there were perhaps 150 representatives in the State House that decided things one way, no, this small group of people are going to say something else. And what then are the people of the state to understand? Some people say it's legal. Some people say it isn't. This is a case that seems to go against, U.S. Supreme Court opinions on a similar procedure of partial birth. What are the people in Kansas to think? How does this create confidence in government? Or does it not create a feeling that, well, even though legally one thing is true, that's not right? Does that not diminish confidence in government in general when one sector of the government says something is legal? This is just on the standards we've discussed. This case satisfies 4 out of these 6 standards, certainly, and especially with an abortion procedure that is as brutal as this one. The court could have exercised judicial restraint. It is a well-known term. It is a well-known principle in the law. They could have exercised restraint and allowed the word of the legislature to stand, but they chose not to. There's another principle in legal interpretation called the principle of specificity, where laws that are very specific will take precedent over provisions in laws or laws that are very general. So here you have the court saying, well, the Constitution, this provision of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness allows abortion, where you have a law in this state that is very specific. It doesn't just use generalized terms about the pursuit of happiness, but it specifically talks about abortion. And not only does it specifically talk about abortion, it talks about a very specific kind of abortion. And the court uses some very general legal language to overturn some very specific legal language. Now, normally this would not be done. If you had 2 conflicting statutes, this would not be done. But here, because the language used is in the Constitution, and the anti-abortion provisions are in a statute or in a law, the court can overlook this. But does it not still go against the principle of statutory interpretation that we're discussing? The fact is that this court obviously wanted to come to a certain conclusion. It stretched in order to get it. But if we look at the decision itself, we find a number of disturbing things. So far right now, we've been talking about what the case has not discussed. What if we talk about what this case did discuss? Well, for one thing, it said that a graphic description of the D&E abortion procedure was not necessary. Well, why not? Perhaps that is the single best illustration of the fact that the court was evading the issue. Why don't you want to look at what this procedure is? Why should that be unnecessary? But nevertheless, the court did not want to look at that. They, curiously enough, they looked at the Constitutional Convention in Kansas in 1859, the convention that put these words into the state constitution, that drafted the words life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And this is the funny part. Curiously enough, they talked about language that the court declined to put into the Constitution, language that was rejected. The rejected language was a provision about the right of all men to the control of their person. The whole abortion argument is based on the fact that women have a right to control their bodies. And here, this Constitutional Convention in 1859 specifically considered language that these inalienable rights that people have to life, liberty, and happiness also included a right to the control of an individual's person, and they rejected it. And yet the court found that right in there anyway. It's irrational. It's inconsistent. It's glaring. How the court doesn't see the irony of quoting this. They researched this historically, found out that this had occurred at the Constitutional Convention, and then put it into their decision. It is an example of how we can twist things when we think without any kind of spiritual basis, without any kind of a basis in God, without any kind of objective morality, where we can decide things simply on the basis of what we want today, and tomorrow it may be different, and we might come to a completely different conclusion. There is no constancy in the law, and that is also something that is very disturbing about this Kansas decision. No constancy in the law. This is the kind of world that we're going to be living in. This is the D&E Times, the distraction and evasion times that we're going to be living in, where there is no solid, just like there's no objective morality, now there will be no objective law, no objective principles of law, only what we want at any given time. Let's see. Here's another one. They quote something about the liberties which inure to each person at birth. There's a prior decision which spoke about this, and they're using this as justification for these inalienable rights, these rights that inure to each person at birth. There are inalienable rights that we have as a matter of nature. And so these inalienable rights include life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and now the right to abortion. But how ironic is it to quote rights that come to people at birth? Because if there's a right that we don't want people to have, that we want to deny, then all we got to do is make sure they never get to the point of birth. Court also talks about Abraham Lincoln and his views at the time that the Dred Scott decision was made. The Dred Scott decision was a case in which the Supreme Court of the U.S. decided that, in essence, slavery was allowed, that your skin color was enough to justify different legal treatment. Certain people with one skin color can have certain legal rights, certain people can have other legal rights. And so they use this case. They use this case to justify their decision on abortion. But the offense that's being discussed by the court is a denial of equality to blacks in comparison to whites. In this case, the question I would ask is, when the court is bemoaning the lack of equality for women and the rights to decide what's going to happen with their own bodies, the rights in comparison to who? Apparently, it's the rights that women have in comparison to men. The men have the right to control their own bodies, so why not women? Apparently, that's the thinking. But the comparison does not hold up. If you're going to talk about the rights of a woman to control her body, when it is only her body, when she is not pregnant, when there's only one body there and not two, then, of course, those rights would be, the rights that a woman would have would be equal to the rights of a man in controlling his body. But when a woman is pregnant and she's carrying another human life, how can you compare that to a man? Because a man never does. It's a comparison that fails. Let's see. They talk about the right to require immunization. That immunization was used. That immunization is allowed, and so that would be a case where if you can force people to get vaccines and immunizations, then that's constitutional. Then you can tell people, well, you don't have control over your body. But how in the world does the example of a state creating a law that says people have to get vaccinated, how does that compare to abortion? How is it that the thinking of a court can be such that they think these, again, are comparable? Where does this kind of principle, the court says, well, you cannot intrude on a person's control over his or her own body when doing so will cause harm to another individual. That's the standard that gets applied to immunizations, and so that's the standard that the state passes, because it will not cause harm to another individual. But where does this give an individual the right to actually harm another individual? The court is saying that immunization works because you can intrude. You cannot intrude. You cannot intrude on a person's right to control their own body when to do so would cause harm to another individual. Again, how ironic. The court is using that in a decision which allows harm to another individual. It is, again, it's curious how they could bring themselves to write these things, how they could bring themselves to cite these examples and put them into their decisions and not see the height of irony that they're engaging in. And the only reason they do is because, they can't see these inconsistencies because they don't ask the fundamental question, whether or not an unborn baby is a human life. If they ask that question, these ironies, these inconsistencies would jump out and become glaring. They assume that the unborn child is not a human life. They assume the answer to the most fundamental question. They assume an answer. They never ask the question. They're in the business of making decisions, of carefully analyzing, coming up with reasons for, and then making a decision. But in this case, they do none of it. None of it. They also quote John Locke in support of the idea that the pursuit of happiness, this terminology that's in the state constitution, they're quoting Locke to say that phrase includes procreation, the right to decide whether or not you're going to be pregnant or not. And apparently, at one point, Locke wrote about, quote, offspring who have a right to be nourished and maintained by them, the parents, till they are able to provide for themselves, close quote. A right to be nourished by your parents until they are able to provide for themselves. Again, how could they bring themselves to actually include this in their decision? You would think that they would want to avoid that they would have some sense of defending their own position that would keep them from including that kind of language until they're able to provide for themselves. You know, how, if you allow abortions, all you do is ensure that children are never able to provide for themselves. Again, it is just so inconsistent. It is so irrational. There are many more examples. These examples of these inconsistencies abound throughout this decision, and yet the court writes them into the decision. Why? They don't see it. They don't see it. They assume an answer. They're talking only about the situation where an unborn child is not a life. It is not a killing. It is not entitled to legal rights. They assume that. They never even answer it. It was their job to answer it. So, yeah. I mean, there are more here. All right. One more. The state of Kansas argued before the court that if you're interested in what the delegates to the Constitutional Convention in 1859 were thinking when they passed this law, so when they adopted the Constitution, if you're interested in thinking what their mindset was, so that you can interpret these words, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, so you can come to an understanding of what they meant by those words, and so therefore we're going to look into what they thought at the times. Well, it might be relevant to consider the fact that in 1855, the territory of Kansas passed a law making abortion illegal. It was a crime. Yes, indeed. They had a law in the territory of Kansas in 1855, a mere 4 years before, specifically declaring another specific law dealing with abortion. We don't have to guess. They specifically considered abortion and made it a crime. The court rejected it. They didn't consider it. They rejected it, and it's just another case of how they're so irrational, how they're so inconsistent. We're concerned with the intent of the delegates, except when it doesn't agree with what we want to say. A court engaged in very inconsistent analysis. They had a result. They wanted to get to it. They twisted things around so they could. This is what we have. But what if we look at the writings of St. Paul? How would that change things? How would we look at things differently? Would it be a help to us? Well, for example, St. Paul obviously wrote about the fact that, or if we're looking at things with that spiritual sense, if we accept the Spirit within us, and we allow the Spirit to be within us, how would we look at things? Well, we'd have a sense for the soul in each individual, and if we had a sense of the soul in each individual, that might at least give us at least some element of fear that we're doing wrong if we allow abortion. It might at least encourage a court or prompt a court to say, all right, I will let the people's representatives decide, instead of having no fear, no compunction, no restraint to go forward and come up with our own individual ideas on what what should be allowed in this subject area. What else? Well, we might have a proper sense of human freedom, that it is not a freedom to do whatever we want when we want, but it is a freedom to unite with God. It is a freedom to get past the bounds of simply being created animals and to exhibit love, to act as if we were, in fact, creatures made in the image of God. It's a freedom that will allow us to unite ourselves to God through love. It would be a sense of freedom that would tell us abortion should not be allowed. What else? There would be a sense, a spiritual mindset would give us a sense of true happiness. And the true happiness is not something that we achieve when we do what we want, when we fulfill our worldly desires, but true happiness is achieved when we live our lives according to what God wants, when we live in love, when we live lives of giving to others rather than taking, where we live lives of self-sacrifice, where we live lives where we imitate Christ. It might give us all a sense of that, and that would also not allow abortion. Would it not give us a sense of the fact that there is eternal life? And if there is eternal life, would we not want to perhaps think twice about allowing abortion? What if we are wrong? What kind of ramifications would that have on our prospects for eternal life? And not to say nothing of the prospects for the unborn children. What else? Well, would it not give us a sense of using faith and reason? And if we coupled faith and reason, would we not have a balanced view? Would we not look at science? Would we not look at abortion through the lens of the progress and the advancements made in science since the time of Roe versus Wade? A science that has allowed us to hear human heartbeats as early, I believe, as 6 weeks in a pregnancy, to be able to detect that these unborn children feel pain. Wouldn't we look at science in a calm, objective, balanced way? Would we not look at the pain caused to the people that have abortions? For years afterwards, they suffer. All we do is we focus on the pain that they may be caused if they have to bear the stresses of anxiety of raising an unwanted child. But when do we deal with or think about or consider the pain and the anguish that they go through for years, decades, to the last day of their lives, dealing with a sense of guilt? There's tremendous pain there. Do we consider that? We would if we cared for them, if we had real compassion for them, if we allowed ourselves to have a balanced view of things that comes from a higher perspective, a spiritual perspective. We would have a sense of a law that is higher. We're talking a lot about law here. We'd have a sense that there is a higher law, that you can be a supreme court, but there's still a law that is higher, and we wouldn't reject it. If St. Paul were alive today, we might have, and were able to write to us, would he not be telling us all of those things? Would saying those things not be consistent with what he did write? But we don't. We don't. We go down this path, and it's one that is not loving. It is divorced from God. It is a case of living in D&E times, where we allow horrible D&E abortion procedures because we distract ourselves. We evade the most fundamental questions. If we had any of these fears or senses of things that would come with a spiritual outlook, would not courts sit back and say, well, these decisions are too complicated for just a few people to make, that it's really a decision for the people as a whole to make, so that when the representatives and a state legislature go ahead and make those decisions, that they should be accorded some respect. How do we have so much pride that we can ignore that? Because we're not even thinking about all of these other issues. We're not thinking about the soul, freedom, true happiness, eternal life. We're not looking at science in any kind of balanced way. We're not looking at the question of whether or not there's a higher objective moral law. We're not looking at so many things that are so important to the happiness, the pursuit of happiness. We think happiness lies in worldly events, worldly things. That's one outlook. It's not the only one. And to say that there is this only one, the one that's grounded in the world, the one that denies religion, is certainly one people can have differing opinions on. There's certainly one that I would say is better than another. The one that does believe in a God, a creator, a morality that comes from God. And many other people, thankfully, in this country still live that way. But courts now are creating constitutional crises by foisting upon themselves the rights to deny other people the ability to look at those other things, to examine that kind of spiritual sense, to look at what really underlies the pursuit of happiness. They deny that people have that right because they think their way is the only way. They are so proud. They don't allow other people their proper role in this government. It is undemocratic. That is why the dissent in the Kansas case has said so forcefully, this restructures government entirely. I think these are the things St. Paul would be saying to us here in America today. You are undoing yourselves. You have a system of government that is not based on God, but at least it didn't deny God. But now you're transforming it to one that does. Think carefully. Turn back. Think, see things, judge things with the Spirit. That was the message that St. Paul gave before. That is the message we still need to hear today. That is the message that we see in our current events not being understood. Well, we hope this has been of some interest. We thank you for listening. We hope you'll enjoy us again. This has been Ray Gerard, and this has been St. Paul's Letters to America. Thank you. God bless.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.